Good morning, Burwood Church. It's my privilege to share with you today from Acts chapter 19 and Acts chapter 20, which really comprises the majority of Paul's third and final missionary journey through Asia Minor. And in this story, we find that Paul, as an apostle, as a shepherd of the church, is really facing culture wars going on in Ephesus, and the majority of his third missionary journey is really focused in on the city of Ephesus. It takes place from about AD 54 through to AD 57. And during this time, while he's in Ephesus, while he's travelling around, he is thought to have written the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, as well as the book of Romans. At the end of this journey, his last major missionary journey, Paul then faces arrest in Jerusalem, imprisonment, and he's sent then back to Rome, where he spends the remainder of his life, thought to be somewhere between 7 and 10 years. So as Paul goes on this very last of his major missionary journeys, he's thought to visit around the places where he's raised up churches, where he has inspired believers, and just to encourage them, to remind them of his teachings, at times to chastise them, and to really invest in the leadership so that this young fledgling church is really built up and is staying true to Jesus. And that's a real challenge we find here, that these new Christians, these young Christians living in the pagan societies that they dwelled, were struggling to come out of paganism, to give up the values of the surrounding world and really fully dedicate themselves to Jesus. And maybe we have some of those same challenges today. Most of the time frame covered in these chapters, as I said, is in Ephesus. He spends more than 2 years and 3 months out of the total 3-year time of the third missionary journey actually in Ephesus, building up the church. Ephesus is a major centre. It's one of the 7 churches of Revelation. It was a secular city, a bustling metropolis of ancient times, and a very difficult place to be a follower of the way, a difficult place to share the message of Jesus. In its time, Ephesus was a city of around 200,000 people, which makes it a little bit smaller than Geelong, about the same size of Hobart, if you've been to Hobart at all, which back in those days, in ancient times, that was massive. Ephesus was also home to one of the 7 wonders of the world, and that was the Temple of Artemis, also known as the Temple of Diana. And you might think, why 2 different names? Well, Artemis was Greek and Diana was Latin, really the same name for the same building. Worship at the Temple of Artemis involved temple prostitutes, and there were many of them. And the Temple of Artemis was huge. It was massive. You could see it from a long way away. It took up an area of about 3 acres or 12,000 square meters. That is a big building. And the roof was thought to have been 18 meters tall. And so it was a big, imposing structure in its day. It's claimed that the Temple of Artemis took 120 years to build. And some historians have even suggested that the mortar between the bricks, well, not the bricks, but the blocks of stone was actually golden mortar. So a very extravagant building to the goddess Artemis. And so, as we've suggested, Ephesus was a wicked city where false worship and idolatry were rampant. It was a major centre of civilization, a major crossroads, a very significant part of the ancient world. And so God saw that this is a critical place to raise up the church and to see Jesus' values and beliefs and teachings shared with the people who needed the hope that comes through knowing Jesus Christ. And we find in these chapters that Luke writes in more detail about Paul's ministry in Ephesus than he usually writes about Paul's evangelistic crusades. And so we get some even greater and deeper insights into the life of Paul and his ministry here. As Paul ministered in this city, we find he returned to the synagogue where he'd previously preached. And in Acts 19 and verse 8, it says that his preaching is bold and that he preached persuasively. And then in verse 11 and 12, it says that God gave him the ability, the unusual ability the ability to perform unusual miracles that really grabbed the attention of the people and brought them in to want to know more about this Jesus and to find more about the way that he was proclaiming about. We see that there was no timidity from Paul. He is proclaiming his faith in Jesus with courage and with confidence. He is not ashamed of the gospel. There is nothing hesitant about Paul. He is a everything in, a boots and all kind of guy. And really what Paul was doing was countercultural. And being countercultural, cutting across the flow and the direction of society of the day, he was likely to tread on toes, and he did plenty of that. On this occasion, he managed to last 3 months preaching in the synagogue before the leaders finally got fed up with his teaching and kicked him out. And so he moved in downtown to a local lecture hall. It's likely that the only time he could have used the lecture hall was in the middle of the day during siesta time. And those people who were still wandering around while most people were sleeping, they were the ones who were listening to him. If we come through to verses 18 to 20, I'm just going to read those from Acts chapter 19. It says, "Many who became believers confessed their sinful practices. A number of them who had been practicing sorcery brought their incantation books and burned them at a public bonfire. The value of the books was several $1 million. It's been suggested about $16 million in Australian dollars in 2021. So the message about the Lord spread widely and had a powerful effect. And scholars, when they're writing about this, remind us that when we accept Jesus, we don't all of a sudden become perfect. We don't all of a sudden become transformed into his likeness, but it's a process. And as we grow and mature in the Christian life, we need to continue to surrender ourselves to God and ask him to take things out of our life that are not compatible with his ways and with his teachings. Continuing on, at verse 23, we find there is a riot in the temple because Paul's ministry is starting to impact pagan worship, and those people with pagan interests were really starting to get worried that Paul's teachings about not worshipping silver idols would eat away at their profits. And so instead of talking about losing profits, they start talking about how Paul is detracting from the worship of the goddess Artemis, and we find a riot begins to break out. I'll pick up a few verses here. Verse 32 says, "Inside the people were all shouting, some one thing, some another. Everyone was in confusion. In fact, most of them didn't even know why they were there." And that says something about mob mentality. Verse 35, "At last the mayor was able to quieten them down enough to speak. 'Citizens of Ephesus,' he said, 'everyone knows that Ephesus is the official guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, whose image fell down to us from heaven.' Verse 37, 'You have brought these men here, but they have stolen nothing from the temple and have not spoken against our goddess.'" And then he continues on and says, look, there's ways about, if you've got a grievance with Paul, take him to court and deal with the evidence. Don't just cause a ruckus in the middle of the city. And in many respects, this message from the mayor, this response from the mayor, was a plea for the Christians to be treated with respect in this pluralistic society that they were living, which is interesting when we consider the ongoing marginalisation of the Christian voice in our society today. Coming across and touching briefly on chapter 20, I'll focus mostly on chapter 19 today, but in chapter 20, I always love the story about Eutychus. And just the whole context of it, it really just appeals to kind of my sense of humour and my builds a picture of God. Eutychus was a young man, probably somewhere between 8 and 14 years of age, and after the sun set on the Sabbath and they gathered together to eat a meal, Paul was leaving the next day, so he was preaching, and as Paul was wont to do, he went on and on for hours until after midnight, and finally Eutychus fell asleep, and he was sitting next to an open window. He fell down 2 floors and died. So Paul went down there, resurrected him, came upstairs and was so, filled with energy and adrenaline as a result of this, that he keeps preaching through to dawn when he leaves the next morning. It's kind of a warning, be careful when and where you fall asleep when somebody's preaching, I guess. Anyway, it's just a really interesting story of God's power and Paul's passion for the gospel. The last part of chapter 20, and the last bit we'll focus on today, is filled with quite a lot of nostalgia. It's Paul's farewell message. And because he was keen to get back to Jerusalem, he didn't want to go into Ephesus again. So the Ephesian Elders came out to meet him at the port of Miletus. And from there, he's going to head back to Jerusalem, where he knows that he's going to be arrested and imprisoned. And so he tells them, I'm never going to see you again. And then he begins to share what is a very classically styled message, farewell message, in that era, where he was firstly giving a testimony about his ministry. This is what I've done. This is where I've been. This is what I stand for. And then he moves on and challenges them about how they should live their lives, how they should minister, how they should build and grow the church. You can imagine the scene. No doubt some shock. We're never going to see you again. Paul was such a significant figure in their life. There were tears, there would have been denial, there would have been all kinds of emotions going on. And it gets you to thinking, if you knew you were never going to see a group of people again, friends, loved ones, you were going on a one-way trip, what message would you leave them? What are the most important values or experiences that you would want to share with people if you were giving a farewell message? For Paul, his key message is that he had been faithful and obedient to God, that he was never shying away from preaching and proclaiming Jesus, standing up for Jesus and inviting people to follow him, regardless of the consequences. And then he leaves them with a challenge at the end. He challenges them to take up this same message of sharing the grace of Jesus Christ. And in addition to sharing the grace and the love of Jesus Christ, he calls them to build up and grow his church. And so I want to leave you with that challenge today, that you should take on the challenge of Paul, to share the grace and love of Jesus Christ wherever you go, and to do everything in your efforts to build up and to grow God's church as we look forward to his soon coming. May God bless you today.